You're tuned into the Unnecessary Harm podcast, where we drill down on issues of substance use and its cultural impact. Your host, Shane Varcoe, Executive Director of the Delgado Institute, with over 40 years experience in youth and community work and a passion for building resilience.
Hey, welcome back to the Unnecessary Harm podcast. Good to have you back with us again. And of course, as always, if this is your first time chiming in, welcome on board. Love to have you here. Connect with us, connect with the content, enjoy the session and share it with those in your network. Well, today's guest has built something extraordinary from the ground up. Annemarie founded Faces and Voices of UK Recovery, or Recovery UK, in 2013 and transformed it into the nation's leading addiction advocacy charity. She established UK Recovery Month, organising 16 annual recovery walks with over 60,000 participants, and created the UK's first dedicated addiction advocacy service. She is a prodigious writer of some substance, engaging in critical subject matter with erudite and at times rarely paralleled insights into the world of addiction and, more importantly, the vital journey out that is recovery. Arguably, her crowning achievement is the Right to Recovery Bill, the world's first legislation offering to enshrine the right to access all paths to recovery in law. Though it has had overwhelming public support, the bill in its current form has stalled in the Scottish Parliament, due in part, and I'm going to put this in as a commentary, to an utterly misguided adherence to wrongly tasked harm reduction ideology in the legislature. But I'm sure there's more to that, and we'll talk about that as we go through today's conversation. However, not to be daunted, 28 years into her own recovery journey, she continues to build the system she wishes had existed when she needed it most. Annemarie Ward, welcome to the Unnecessary Harm podcast.
Wow, what an introduction. Thank you so much, Shane. I feel utterly fraudulent, but very grateful.
It's called the imposter syndrome. We all suffer from it.
Yeah, so many people have helped me do all that. So it feels fraudulent for me to take credit, but I've had many people help me over the years to do what I've done. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. Let's get into that. That's a good place to start, because I know that's not who you are. I mean, we're not here to blow smoke up your dress, to use a very crass idiom, but it is to celebrate and to showcase that which has happened. And of course, it's a team effort. It's a remarkable work, but let's kick off, because a lot of people, particularly down under and in Southern Hemisphere, wouldn't, some of them will be, I have no doubt, particularly in the recovery space. And we work with the recovery alumni, we work with a little bit with the supply reduction space, but our primary focus is primary prevention. But yeah, so that's our kind of wheelhouse. But your work, has because of the work you've done in the UK, has got a global echo. So it's really important to look at that. But let's get to know you a little bit, and let our listeners hear a little bit about your journey, because this all doesn't come about because I had a brain moment, a light bulb went bonk, and I'm going to do something. And this is actually birthed out of a long and assiduously pursued hard work, Annemarie. So tell us about, if you can, with as much as you feel comfortable doing, your journey into, and more importantly, out of addiction, and what's some of the things that have shaped where we are now?
Okay, yeah, I'll try and be as concise as possible, because I know that's a big question. So, born in Scotland, Ayrshire, small seaside town. Both my parents were alcoholic, my mother much later in life, my father earlier. There was the usual chaos, violence, abuse that goes with that environment. Growing up, I've got 3 siblings. None of them found solace or relief in alcohol or other drugs, but I did from a very young age. I had my first drink when I was 11, and I pursued that relief and release with obsession and compulsion right from the first time I experienced it. I also got my first job when I was 12 in a wee local cafe, which provided me with money and access to nicotine. You know, I could steal the cigarettes, and I also started stealing to feed my addictions very, very young. So, you know, the immoral behaviour was there quite quickly as well, because I now know that I was, you know, obsessed with that comfort and release that comes with, you know, whatever substance it is. I went on to, you know, use other substances, 14, 15, started dabbling with, you know, class A drugs, you know, and at the end of my using, there was two things that were always strong in my story. One was that working class ethic of you're fine if you go to your work. There's no problem as long as you go to your work. And,
Functional drug user, huh?
Yeah. And so poly drug use. So I would switch between drugs on a regular basis, not consciously as an attempt to control, but now looking back, I can see that that was an unconscious attempt to control. So part of my denial system was, even though I was using class A drugs, including, you know, smoking smack and crack on a semi-regular basis, I was still showing up for my work every day, so there wasn't a problem. But I went to my first mutual aid meeting when I was 25 in order to get information about how to help my mother get sober. And as God or a higher power or luck or serendipity or providence or coincidence, whatever way you want to look at it, I tend to look at it as God would have it. I have not used alcohol or other drugs since that first meeting, and it was a profound awakening for me. I obviously went through that program, the 12-step program, and had a gradual spiritual awakening as well. And throughout that process of being in the community of people in recovery, I was able to come across women and men who had suffered in the same way that I had as a child, you know, which included sexual and physical abuse. And I surrounded myself with a community of people who had healed from that and who could show me how to live without the use of drugs. And I'm still part of that community today, and I pass on that information and that love and care today, I hope, in the way that was passed on to me. My home group is on a Saturday morning in Woodlands Road, 10:30. You can find me there in Glasgow. So, you know, I'm still very much...
Shameless plug right there. Yeah. Fantastic.
Yeah. You know, so, and I found myself in this work really by accident. I had no intention of coming into this sector. I was approached when my son was at nursery. I was asked to come on his board, and there was someone on that board who took a wee shine to me and saw that I had something, and they asked me to apply for a job, and that job was actually an advocacy role, but I didn't realise it at the time. And those men were a big part of that job, and those men were a big part of my healing as well, because I had a small child, I was on my own, I was a single mum, I was at university, I was working part-time, and these guys were of the sort of the old school labour thinking. It was a small community project that had been devastated by the closures of the mines, and it was based in a new town in Scotland. So there was a lot of deprivation, a lot of drug and alcohol use, but the role that I ended up in was an advocacy role, and I discovered throughout that role, having had no contact with the treatment system before that, because I had got well through mutual aid,
of course,
that the system didn't actually even believe in the mutual aid fellowships. It thought it was something to be avoided, and I was given a very rude awakening, a baptism of fire into the addiction sector, and all the prejudices and stigma that go along with that. So,
wow.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. It's a very synoptic and, you know, look at it, quite a remarkable journey. And the journey into substance use, but also, and I'm not going to go down this particular path because we'd be here for an hour talking about the science behind this. We've actually done a couple of papers on this recently, and some has been published. One of them particularly has been published in a major journal on this whole area of the first encounter with the substance. And there was one academic used the term, and your story personifies this. He used the term, and this is a high-level academic in a paper, which I'm not going to quote, but he said it's like when that young adolescent brain encounters this moment, this euphoric / powerful sedation, transition out of trauma, whatever it may be. It's like the word is nuclear device going off in the brain, but also in every cell in your body. It's a cellular manifestation. And for some people like yours, it's like, wow, like this is the answer.
Yeah.
And consequently, when you get the answer, you pursue it, and even though it's a false answer, a counterfeit answer, an ultimately destructive answer, it met an immediate felt need, and it kept meeting that need until it demanded you to meet its need.
Yeah.
And therefore the problem started. But yeah, and of course the second thing I like, and for those listening who are in predicaments, and I had a meeting today with a bunch of local government people, and one of the young mums in the group who's also a safety officer for their local government, we call it local government areas, right? Like councils, if you like, council areas for your space, for your listeners, is she grew up with an alcoholic father, but that consequence for her was, I'm not touching this. And I've worked with people over the years, many different environments, men and women. They go either way. It's like they don't touch it ever because they saw what it did, or it becomes the avenue by which they self-medicate to deal with the trauma. So, but that's the first one. So people listening to this, guys, Annemarie's got some really good insights. The work she's done is fabulous. So tap into that. We'll talk about that later on. But secondly, the functional drug addict. I mean, this is the classic straw man. I'm going to use that word that the pro-drug activists love to put up. That if we just introduce harm reduction and keep these functioning drug addicts safe and alive, they're cool. It's all good. Let's not. It's utter rubbish, and it's one of the most dehumanising factors that can be done. But we'll talk about that in a moment. But firstly, I've set up a bit of an issue here. It's been fascinating to watch the emergence of the lived experience and earned resiliency vehicles. I use that word, vehicles, in the space. And I remember in Australia about 8 or 9 years ago when this started emerging, we'd argued for this space. But when the sector started talking about it, we went, well, yeah, hello, we get this. And it's where people started to use this lived experience and earned resiliency in an education context to inform, to empathise, to enable again that shared community process. Because the person with lived experience and earned resiliency, important both together, lived experience and resiliency, was seen as authentic knowledge holders. In other words, they're not just telling horror stories, been through the crapper, came out the other side. Oh yeah, that drugs suck. Yeah, stuff my life up. It's rubbish. Don't do it. It's no. It's like I've learned a whole lot of lessons about life that I wish I'd learned before I went in, and I want to help you get those lessons in place so you don't go down this rabbit hole. So it's really important that it's that these actors were supposed to help people reorient towards a recovery framework. And help people get restored in addiction. But that's starting to shift a bit now. It's starting to be hijacked, which we're going to talk a bit about later on. So your experience, now this is obviously, and I want to specifically focus on lived experience and earned resiliency. These are two factors in your world that are driven and shaped, perhaps as a kinder word, shaped what you've done. Tell us about how that works for you in the Faces and Voices of Recovery.
Well, I suppose staying clean and sober first and foremost gives me the ability to complete anything that I start. So it just gives me that muscle, that perseverance, that tenacity. These are spiritual principles that I am encouraged to practice as part of my recovery program. So it means that when I put my mind to something, there is a stubborn streak, that if, unless it's detrimental, and this work has felt at times detrimental to my mental health in particular, but I've been able to, put a positive spiritual spin on that there is, I am Catholic, so there's an element of sacrifice and crucifixion involved, in anything I think that's worth doing. So from a resiliency point of view, those early years, probably those first 5 years of my recovery were about healing and about understanding. I was talking about it with a friend last night, in fact, James Docherty, and we were commenting about someone who has quite a high profile, someone who regularly posts pictures of themselves when they're using, and that redemption story of, how healthy they are now. And this person went quite quickly into academia and has, built a reasonable profile and a decent career for themselves, which, we applaud hugely. But James and I were saying we are not the same. We had severe trauma. I was 5 years clean and sober before I thought, okay, I'm on steady ground here. It took me that long to feel like, okay, I can maybe dare to dream. And that was a theme of a conference, actually, that I attended in my early recovery, Dare to Dream. I had never even dared to dream about, a life. I was just surviving so much. So I think having survived and came through, the worst of what life has to offer, really, and I'm not presenting a hero story here, but
No.
I genuinely did become my own hero as a single mum, going to university with a small baby, being very ill during that time. I won't bore you with the problems that I had. But and also working and taking care of myself and taking care of this. I went through some pretty resilient character building, character shaping behaviour during that time, and in an environment, the west coast of Scotland, where if you don't drink and you don't smoke and you don't take drugs, there's you're suspect. It's very counter-cultural to behave in that way, especially as a working class young woman, at that time. I was definitely pushing against the grain, so I am used to, I'm forged in that fire, and I always had that element in my character, even as a young child, when everyone else was sort of kowtowing to the abuser, or, walking on eggshells and keeping their mouth shut.
Yeah.
Even as a small child, I was like, that, I was speaking aloud, this isn't fair. I was saying, this, this has to stop. I always had that injustice in my character. So I think over the years, that has stood me very well. Some people would see that as a defect, but I see it as a real strength,
I'll chime in on that. I think it's interesting that you talk about your formative years, prior to your engagement with substances. You are and it's difficult to explain this without going into some of the science behind it, but your natural predilection is for advocacy and justice. I mean, as a child, you're saying, hey, this sucks, this isn't right, you can't do that. And the cognitive dissonance that you're experiencing and the emotional trauma and the violence that is part of that. And I'm talking about physical and emotional violence, spiritual violence. Let's put that in there as well, because they are three very real and separate categories. That creates that dissonance in a high justice advocate person that goes, and it's like, I don't know how to manage this. And as an 11-year-old, you go, and then someone goes, have a drink, calm down, chill out. And you go, bang, this works. I still remember one of our early training videos. We got a series of teaching videos and curriculum for schools called I Wish I Never. And one of the women on that, she's a remarkable trophy of grace, just a remarkable, same story. Well, very similar, sorry, not the same, so very similar. Sexually abused, not yours, that was your story, but she was sexually abused by a family member at 10 and 11. And at a party, someone, one of the relatives said, "Oh, have a little drink, darling, you'll be right." And she said that moment was the first time in her life all these internal stopped. So of course that's your go-to, and that kind of, now you've gone through that shocking process, and I know in your world you go, I wish I'd never, because that's part of the deal. But now you've harnessed that and you've gone, that shouldn't have happened, but it's not going to happen again. I'm going to work to make sure that this doesn't happen for others. And that's the driver. So that little 11-year-old advocate, that passionate justice warrior, was sidetracked. But now, by redemptive processes, has been re-equipped and retasked in a more remarkable way. And this is the beauty of, we don't want to, this is the thing you talk about hero stories. And we have to be very careful because we train educators and using the recovery alumni in education spaces. Of course, the bad actors hate that. They tell stories, oh, you put up drug users, it's bad practice. No. We're not putting up ex-drug users. We're placing lived experience and earned resiliency, authentic knowledge holders equipped with evidence and research, not to tell their story, but to talk about resiliency, to talk about building best practice, to talk about not having to step off the cliff in the first place. And that's what we're doing. And you're doing that at the recovery end, which I think is fantastic. And again, I just want our listeners to get this. This is not let's go and do drugs so we can be heroes. No. Nothing about this is this process of pain is heroic. Nothing about this process of grief and trauma is beneficial. It's the redemption process. It is the redemption process that goes back to the best practices of abstinence, best practice, always has been, always will be, and finding that right place forward where the human, your human well-being and your human capacity and agency are connecting in a powerful way with community. Now, I'm on a bit of a roll here, but I really, really, really want to labour this point, guys, because Annemarie and people in the space that she's in are mobilising and equipping and building social and emotional and moral and capital and agency back into communities that are broken. And that's what this can do. This is not about having to go through the crap to get it right. It's about getting it right and using every resource available for you to do it. So just listen to that little rant of mine over them every now and then, Annemarie. My listeners sometimes clap me, sometimes they go, shut up, right? So that's my moment. But yeah, thank you. I just, really good. Appreciate it. As I hinted in previous question, there's been a bit of a shift in the tasking of language. And I think, the old argument, if you control language, you control culture, which we know the bad actors are very good at doing that. Mm-hmm. So a growing number of clearly manipulated in spaces, this whole notion of using what we just talked about and being seen as a bad thing, they're starting to shift that narrative now to lived and living experience. Now, that is a really fascinating, well, and certainly in Australia, that's not being tasked to help people exit drug use. That's helping people tasked to walk alongside those continuing drug use and helping them stay alive while they continue to use drugs. So it's been, I don't know if that's happening where you are, but I wanted to talk about that because language hijacking, and one of the reasons we do the Unnecessary Harm podcast, is that we are seeing this happen repeatedly. The unnecessary harms are created and they're perpetuated by bad practice and by manipulation and by hijacking. And I'm not talking everyone in the sector. It's some good people who are genuine harm reductionists, hate drugs, want drugs to stop, want the people that they're dealing with to be off drugs, but they will use harm reduction mechanisms to keep them alive whilst they exit drug use. But then the bad actors come in underneath, the pro-drug activists, they hijack harm reduction techniques and vehicles, and they use it to normalise drug use. So talk to us, are you experiencing that similar kind of manipulation of policy and language?
Absolutely. And I think it actually, the living experience catchphrase was actually created in Scotland. So, and it was in response to, and listeners can go and look this up. It was in response to our campaign. We had a campaign in 2019 that started just before COVID called You Keep Talking, We Keep Dying. And it was a massively pressurised campaign that we put on the Scottish Government by organising and mobilising people in the communities in the Glasgow area and the surrounding areas that were being most affected by the high drug death rate. As you know, it's the worst in Europe. 3.5 times more than equally deprived areas, even in England. You know, Newcastle, just across the border, has the same amount of, you know, deprivation, cultural.
It's the same demographic,
inputs. Yeah. So,
not as badly
we saw the living experience phrase come in during that time, because what happened was the press really got behind us in Scotland. And politicians, local councillors, local members of the Scottish Parliament, even members of the UK Parliament, started to coalesce at our events. And the narrative was, the narrative that we were putting out was, there's not enough funding going into prevention. We have abandoned the prevention literature and practice for the last 25 years. We need prevention programmes back in our schools, back in our communities. That recovery is possible, but you have to give people access to it. And currently our system is 98% harm reduction focused. And of course, like you, we are not against harm reduction. We're just asking for a balanced system. But the system has become so ideologically focused that those bad actors have took it a step further into legalisation. And the decriminalisation and legalisation debate in Scotland is very much alive. And we have government-sponsored quangos creating that and paying for that and, you know, pushing us in that direction. So the living experience term was coined by one of our main quangos, and it took off across the world. I saw it happening, and it was an attempt to control the narrative again, saying, right, okay, the lived experience, i.e., which was people who had recovered, so people that were previously lived, had that past. We're now speaking for, so we can't speak for them because they've got the press behind them. They've got, you know, a different narrative to ours. So they coined that phrase, living experience, and then started to manipulate. And I think, like you say, it's not just hijack. There's you know, we sort of fell for elements of it unconsciously as well as an organisation. So this whole idea that you can be in recovery if you say yeah. You know, and it's, you know, in Scotland we have quite controversial things going on, as I know they're going on across the world around, you know, you're a woman if you say yeah. So it becomes this sort of hollowing out language that, you know, the truth is your truth rather than the truth. So we've got this sort of
disconnected from fact completely.
Yeah, this thing going on. So that living experience narrative was created falsely, so as those people who are in positions of influence and seen as the experts could regain and get control again of the narrative and set themselves apart from. And of course, one of the ways that they continue to do that is to say that we are abstentionists, God crazy, God squad, you know, purists, and, you know, they try and paint us as extremists when actually we straddle and have, since our inception, that middle ground of, you know, harm reduction and recovery are on the same continuum here.
It's a continuum, that's it.
But there is not enough funding going into the recovery end. We're, you know, in Glasgow, for instance, we have a £50 million treatment budget, and only 1.3 million of that is going on rehab. And actually what we've seen them do is say, oh no, actually there's 5 million going into residential placements. Now when you scrape that, again, this is controlling the language, those residential placements are not rehab. They are so-called stabilisation centres, which are a complete misnomer. Again, another Scottish invention.
Correct.
You know, like you cannot stable a condition that is unmanageable and uncontrollable, right? Like this is addiction. It's not controllable or manageable. If it was, it wouldn't be addiction. You cannot
Correct.
stabilise a condition that is out to kill you and, you know, that you're completely powerless over when you're in that obsession and compulsion. So we can see that in Scotland, particularly, that ideology of harm reduction has become like a religion, and it's got high priests and it has people who are in positions of expertise that are government funded that are pushing us in the direction of legalisation. So I know when the original harm reductionists in the UK, people like Dr. John Strang, guys like Mark Gilman, you know, these were people who were not using harm reduction as a Trojan horse for legalisation. And that is now, in order for you to call yourself a harm reductionist now, in some camps, you have to be pro-legalisation, that you're not, and it's became not just like a religion, but it's became like an identity as well.
Of course,
and I say often in the absence of real identity and real religion, that these become, you know, places where people can hang their virtue hooks to say, like,
of course,
you know, so
it's counterfeit religion. I mean, passionately held ideology, to use again religious language, is called idolatry. You got to worship something, so people set up idols, and of course, if they're ideologically attached, it gives them purpose. And this is another big problem we've talked about in our training of people with the 3 I's. Everyone needs true identity, true non-sexual intimacy, and true impact. There's just 3 basic things that humans need. Now, if you can't get them legitimately that benefit society and develop it and grow it, make it safer, healthier, stronger, more robust, more resilient, then it'll do the other. But it's still, I'm trying to find identity, trying to find intimacy, and I'm trying to find impact. So, yeah, you're right.
Hey, before we continue, we want to highlight an excellent cousin podcast you should definitely check out. Pathways to Prevention with Dave Clausen. Dave brings incredible, proactive and protective insights that really complement the work we're doing here at UHP. That's pathway number 2, prevention. Make sure you subscribe and give it a listen. Now, back to UHP.
And I think and I'm glad you've clarified that, the origins of that living experiencing. I wasn't aware of that. I didn't think it eventuated in Australia, but we were the world leaders in harm reduction. We created it and exported it in 1985 to the world. So that's on us. Sorry, world. That's on us. But again, harm minimisation in Australia, for those who've heard me talk about this before, but for perhaps those listening in other continents, harm minimisation in Australia is a 3-pillared strategy. First and foremost pillar is prevention. Always lauded, always spoken of highly, but never funded, really. Second is supply reduction. Those two are inseparable. In fact, they're inseparable. They go together. The third one was harm reduction. Again, important pillar. It's to help people keep people alive who are struggling under the tyranny of addiction, keep them alive whilst they exit drug use. Now, what's happened? The bad actors got in, they hijacked harm reduction. Now the term harm reduction and harm minimisation are interchangeable. So all of a sudden people say, the Australian drug policy is harm reduction. And of course we have pill testing and all those other rubbish things. Of course, all those things just interfere with prevention and supply reduction. If you have an injection room and you have pill testing or drug checking, then you are directly going against prevention supply. You've got one pillar actively working against the other two. But that's okay. And again, the process you talked about, you start with the idea is to normalising drug use is you depenalise, you basically treat it like it's not really an issue. Then you depenalise, then you decriminalise, you normalise, then you legalise. That's kind of the journey. And we've had pushes in this country. We've pushed back and we've managed to keep it still illegal for the most part, although decriminalisation has happened. And we have no problem. We have a problem with decriminalisation as such. you don't have to decriminalise a drug to make it to create diversion and mechanisms. The criminalisation of drug use does not have to be punitive, and we won't go down that rabbit hole. We've talked about that on a number of occasions. But again, I want to speak a little bit more about the mechanisms that are continually revisited to try and legitimise misuse of harm reduction. And opioid substitute treatments, for want of a better term, MATs, OSTs, whatever you want to do, liquid handcuffs, we'll call them, because that's kind of a common one, methadone being the largest and most prominent of those. I still remember we used to have NA run in our offices here. And of course, NA, for those who aren't aware, they insist on paying for their work. They want to be self-governed, and we value that. The 12-step program is fantastic. The science behind the 12-step program is now irrefutable. So let's put that on the table too. Science behind 12-step program is irrefutable, people. It works, and it works not because it's because it's spiritual, because it deals anthropologically with the human unit, not just sociologically or psychologically. It deals with every aspect of the human agency and human capacity, and not just behavioural issues. It's worldview, it's belief systems, it's everything. So therefore, those who engage in that, and even Carl Jung, he bought into that finally in the end as well. He understood that. But I digress. But the point being is, we had NA in here, and they were having lunchtime meetings, and we're getting between 6 and 20 people show up. And I still remember one day, and I want to talk to you about this and your experience in this space, Annemarie. The guy running the place, we're good friends, and he said, "It's interesting, Shane. We've had our first one of many first 28-year-old has come and joined us." I said, "Oh yeah, well, it's great news." He said, "Yeah, he got off heroin at 18 when they put him on methadone. He's now come to NA to get off methadone." Talk us through liquid handcuffs.
Well, I suppose, I'm actually quite hopeful in this area, conversely, and perhaps even perversely, because in Scotland we've seen the polydrug use, mutate so much that it's cocaine that most people are using now, and that is the drug that is, causing the most damage here in Scotland. And the liquid handcuffs, the substitute prescription drugs like heroin, like methadone, like Buvidal, etc., are not the tool that is. Although I have to add that we've seen people approach services in Scotland, and we have this on film, we have it on record. ITV News covered it. We were accused of lying about this for several years. That people who have a cocaine problem are now being treated with methadone. Now that, as far as I'm concerned, is a worldwide scandal and needs scrutinised and investigated. But that is actually going on. But the reason why I am perhaps perversely optimistic is because there is no substitute prescription really for cocaine, for ketamine, for benzodiazepines, for nitazines, for these drugs that, so the only toolbox that we have, the only tool in our toolbox currently in Scotland is substitute prescriptions. We pay lip service to all the other stuff, and we say that that's required and needed, like you said, prevention and recovery services. But if I can just show you how much like lip service it is by telling you, what we spend our money on. And Glasgow is a microcosm of the rest of the UK, in fact. Yeah. So we have 24 placements on the heroin-assisted treatment programme, which is, mainline diamorphine. And those places are completely, you can stay on that as long as you like. So there's no time limit on the HAT programme.
No sunset clause.
Yeah, so there's 24 places available for 24 people, and it costs somewhere between 4 and 6 million. We're not quite sure a year, right? So this is in Glasgow.
Wow.
Then we have the drug consumption room, which is next door, which they
Sorry,
say
I shouldn't laugh.
It's in the same building, right?
Oh wow.
which they say costs 2.3 million, but I think we'll probably see that that's nearer 4 million. So that's, probably 10 million straight away on a service that is only helping a handful of people, right? Or helping, and I use the word helping, with caution.
Yeah, I hear you.
And yet Glasgow only has 23 rehab beds, and you can only access those rehab beds for 12 weeks at a time. So I think, and the other 40 million of that 50 million is going into the system of social workers and nurses who manage those substitute prescriptions, so who do the bureaucracy and the paperwork. So, and we know from David Best's research that if you are lucky enough to see one of those social workers or nurses, only 12 minutes of that hour that you see them will be therapeutic. And we know from the people that we've advocated for from our advocacy service in the last 4 years that there are some people they've been with the service for 20 odd years. They don't even have case notes. There's no record of their time with that particular organisation. When we ask for case notes, they're hastily put together. There's no record of, how many times that person has asked for rehab and not been given it, or if they have, there's no record of why that decision was made, or who made that decision that they weren't to get rehab. So if you look at that £50 million treatment budget and where that money's going, it's not going into recovery-orientated care. It's going into maintaining and containing people in a system. So the reason why I'm hopeful is because there are so many more people now in that system and so many more people entering into that system. And the only way out of it, statistically, is to die.
Yeah.
So that scrutiny, and I think because the media and the press have got behind us in Scotland, and partly because I think the deaths are so high and so conversely high, even to our nearest neighbours in England, that scrutiny is now coming from people out with the sector, because it's easy to defer to the experts within the sector. But even yesterday, I was being interviewed by a journalist at The Economist. So, there's people outside the sector going, what's going on here? So there is no substitute prescription for cocaine or for nitazines or for any of these drugs. So I think,
Correct.
I think we will have to return to a recovery orientation if we want to stop these deaths eventually. And that dawning of that realisation will eventually click. And I think the vested interests of keeping that system in place are starting to be exposed, whether those be systemic vested interests and the quangos. It's very clear in Scotland, I'm very lucky to be based here because if anybody that reads my Substack, they can see that I've documented this quite forensically with the Right to Recovery Bill, particularly through the Right to Recovery Bill, and how that whole process was skewed because the systemic interests were so opposed to any change. But I think it's just going to become harder and harder for those systemic interests to justify, rationalise and defend the system, because the deaths are going to continue to rise.
Perfect. That, sadly, is an incredibly brilliant and concise synopsis of what's actually happening. And similarly in Australia, perhaps not with the severity, but again, I still remember, again, for the sake of your listeners, in the space you're in, Annemarie, is back in the late 90s, we had a major heroin problem in our state, in Victoria here, and in New South Wales as well. People were dropping like flies. It was, it's 900 deaths, a year. A famous professor who's an institute named after him, Mr. Pennington in Australia, he said, if we don't have a safe injecting room, if we don't have, A, B and C, we're going to see deaths on the streets, right? It's going to be wholesale. Oh, hue and cry went out, right? During that time, there's a couple of very important things collided, which was very helpful. The police said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to go double down, not for punitive purposes. We're going to double down on supply reduction. We're going to double down on arrests for diversion. And there's also a bit of a drought in the Golden Triangle, which is in Southeast Asia, just north of us, which is one of our big suppliers here. Consequently, the deaths plummeted the next year to next to, I think, in basically just in double digits. So, supply reduction, hardline enforcement, diversion shifted the entire narrative. And of course, that shot him to pieces. But then years later, we started doing again. That message is forgotten. And in the same mob, his group now, not with him in charge, start peddling this. We need to decriminalise everything because we've got all this. And all they do is fund and source data to, again, reinforce their narrative. That's what they do. They have these lived experience and people living with intravenous drug use resource every 5 to 10 years. And it's interesting the amount of people that are still in it and how messed up they are. But they laud that as something, we need to manage these people and give them more. And it's just fascinating to watch that. Now, just on one little caveat here before we go on. For those, because there will be some people who go, how dare you? I know of a number of people in a number of settings where methadone has been useful in helping people whilst they exit drug use. Again, we have no problem with an OST or MAT or whatever if it's got a sunset clause, if it's part of a overall recovery journey, if it's part of, in other words, you go to 6 weeks, we're going to reduce your amount of substance engagement, and then we get counselling, we get job placement, we get medical, all those things. We will concede that's a possibility. But the current model is not that at all. It is people that are 20 years, 25 years on an opioid. Yeah. So anyway, I'm really glad you talked to it.
Well, just to go back to that for a wee minute, like the evidence base for methadone was always built on it being, people coming off, titrated to, a dose that was, roughly around 30 mil, 40 mil or somewhere that, kind of held people. And then there was the evidence base, this is how you then come off. So that was always the idea behind it. So, but we've never delivered methadone in an evidence-based way. And that phrase in itself, the evidence base says this is used with such muscularity by the experts, but we don't actually deliver it in an evidence-based way. We never have. And particularly in Scotland, we've always had a script and go service. So get the drug and that's you. There's no psychosocial support. There's no gradual reduction. There's no program, to get off it. So we've never delivered it in an evidence-based way at all. And now we have this situation where the pharmaceutical companies have, again, dominated the narrative about addiction being a chronic relapsing condition. So that means you need lifelong maintenance. Well, actually, when I got clean and sober, that was not the narrative. The narrative was you can and do recover. Here's how you do it.
Correct.
So like, I'm I'm a big fan of history. So history is told by the people who have got the most compelling and the strongest narrative that goes, fastest, that spreads fastest, or that people are more willing to hear, and I think most people understand. I mean, the dogs in the street in Glasgow know that the methadone programme hasn't worked, but yet there's a whole set of experts who claim that it does. And they're just like, what are you measuring here? Are you measuring?
Exactly.
And this is the major problem for me. The major problem for me is not how many people are we keeping alive. What we should be measuring is how many people are living and how many people have, contributing productive members of society again. And I don't think that contribution and production has to be about, being part of the capitalist system and earning, you can contribute to your community by volunteering. You can, it's about purpose. It's about living. It's about contributing. It's about feeling part of. And addiction is the opposite of that. Addiction completely isolates us from ourselves, from our families, from like that human connection. That's exactly what addiction is. And going back to, that first drink that I had, the first time, what I experienced with that balm, that soothing balm that alcohol gave me, was a relief from the lack of connection that I had. So I felt like a square peg in a round hole, like in the world. Like I was just like, I don't I didn't belong here. Like, I couldn't connect. And alcohol took that, and other drugs took that. It soothed that loneliness, that aloneness, that separation, that isolation. And it wasn't until I did my step 4 and 5 that I got connected to the human race for the first time in my life, because trauma had removed me, it had disconnected me and isolated me long before alcohol and drugs compounded that, So, I mean, this is what we should be measuring. We should be measuring, someone's dignity. How are they contributing to life? What are they feeling? What are they thinking? How, are they part of their family again? Are they part of their community? Are they healthy? Are they taking care of themselves? Are they learning? These are the things that we should be measuring, Yeah.
Are they alive?
Yeah.
Alive. That's powerful. I think the statement that the gold standard of harm reduction is avoiding death. That's the best they can offer.
Yeah.
And that's not living. That's, as you said, that's not developing our humanity. Yeah. That's not developing our agency.
And you spoke earlier about, this narrative and the sort of common frame from extreme harm reduction advocates is you can't recover if you're dead. Yes, we know that, but you have to have something to worth living for. And go back to what you were saying about, the police response. In Scotland, our police services have been really centralised. So, where we used to have individual, regional or community police forces, that has now been centralised to the point where it's much easier to control the police response as well here. And of course the police aren't funded. The police have got, trying to do their job with one arm behind their back when it comes to this stuff.
Yes.
And there is an element of the harm reduction or the legalised, the war on drugs narrative. That is quite, on the surface, it's very compelling, as are most of these arguments on the surface. It's when you scrape a wee bit deeper that you see, right, okay, my drug use, my alcohol use, that affected everybody around about me,
Correct.
And it affects the whole community. So it's not my right.
It's not a victimless crime.
Yeah, my not a victimless crime. To use drugs or my bodily autonomy. These are all the arguments that are put forward, isn't it?
Of course.
They have an impact on the rest of my community, and even people who think they're not affected by drug use, you're hugely affected by it. This isn't just the lens that I look through. Particularly now that drug use has become so normalised, which is not inevitable. Again, I was talking to a friend about this. Do you remember how we stopped people from smoking cigarettes, right? And we did that through a series of health measures. Like
Australia led the world in that one,
Yeah, we stigmatised it. We made it socially unacceptable. We highlighted the health harms. And actually the contradiction is that with drugs we're doing the opposite. We're removing the stigma. We're saying that we need to, in Scotland we had a campaign a few years ago that was about destigmatising drug use.
Yeah.
I mean, it was crazy,
I know.
I'm like, bring back the
That's
stigma.
big in Australia.
Bring back the
stigma. Yeah. Big in Australia. Yeah. And we've there's been media consultations that the media cannot now longer use the word, they can't mention if a person's on drugs who's done a crime, can't use the word addict, cannot use the word drug user. All this is now, this is about how you control narrative. Yeah. As I said, control language, control narrative. Yeah. It's an age-old propaganda mechanism. Yeah.
And I must so Australia's we fell for that for a wee while, actually. So we would, we were training people to, like, say, my name's Annemarie, I'm a personal long-term recovery. For me, that means I haven't used alcohol or other drugs. So I consciously did remove the word addict and clean and sober from my own public speaking. But then I was just like, why am I doing this? I could see the initial argument, on the surface argument about stigma. And then I thought, no, actually, what I was being told to do was to ignore the culture that I got well in. And I was being asked to be disloyal to the culture they get well in. There's no stigma in the word addict for me. There's no stigma in using the word clean for me. No. It's a celebration. I know what exactly I am, what I'm suffering from, what I'm recovering from, and what I have to be vigilant about going forward, you know.
Perfect.
And there's a much bigger conversation if people did understand what it meant to be an addict actually means, and it's not just about substance use. You know, the behavioural addictions are off the chart with gaming and, you know, the internet and pornography and spending. You know, like if there was an educational project that needed done, it's not around destigmatising drug use, it's about educating people about obsessive compulsive behaviour and why we're in that, why we do that, why we get stuck in that.
Perfect. Yeah, and that's a conversation for another day, not today, but that's a brilliant one. Yeah. And again, we've done on our World Resiliency Day platform, for those who follow that in the Bounce Back blog, there's a number of articles on there about dopamine cartels, what the big tech are doing, how they buy into that, and they actually feed into this system of addiction creation. Addiction for profit industries always do that. Yeah. They have to create dependency to maximize returns. That's all. It's just marketing 101. Get people involved young, keep them for their lifetime, and you've got them. Whether it's with shopping, whether it's recreational activity that is obsessive, of course. So look, Annemarie, this is like awesome. I'm loving this, and again, there's a lot of other things we could talk about, and we're clicking on an hour now. But I don't want to shut it down. But I do want to finish up with a couple of things. You did give us a little bit of I want to end with a positive, a little bit of insight into your perverse, positive hope for the future. I mean, that was one thing. What's one of the things that one of the hopes that keeps you going? Now, hope, as we've defined on our platforms, is not just a positive expectation of good, it's the reasonable grounds for it. So what do you hope for, and what are the reasonable grounds for it?
Well, I think as a movement, the recovery movement, and I've just published a piece on LinkedIn today about this, saying we don't really have a movement. It's been astroturfed, the grassroots has been hijacked. People have, sold their soul and profited, and, but I'm hopeful because I think there's a moral shift happening across the world. I think there's a consciousness shift happening, without, being too hippy-dippy like here around, the age of Aquarius and all that nonsense. I do think there's a genuine swing happening that the sort of liberal elite or the liberal project has failed in many Western countries. So I am very hopeful that a return to both common sense and when I think about the 1930s, right, and of course a lot of our politics are talking about that time, because there's much talk about fascism and totalitarian governments, and and in the UK we're experiencing very.
They were the progressive of their day. Yeah. It's the progressive movement that led us into the chaos, but we'll keep going.
Yeah, the Weimar Republic, and Hitler. These guys were nationalist socialists. So I'm hopeful because I can see a lot of young people who are sort of pushing against that liberalisation. Like my son, for instance, doesn't drink. My nephew is very interested in starting a family and taking care of their health in a way that my generation just wasn't. They're pushing back against this liberal elite self-destructive tyranny. I mean that's how they describe it to me.
Good word.
They just want to live. So I'm hopeful that the younger generation has seen the folly of maybe our generation's ways, and that there will be a reorientation towards community and family life again. And I see that shift happening, or certainly the seeds of that shift. And, if I look at the time, as I said, in the 1930s, right, what was born out of that time as well? Obviously there was great upheaval, Great Depression, great, poverty, but necessity is the mother of all invention. So even if we continue to go down, the routes, and I've just wrote a piece about rent and rent costs here in Scotland, and life has never been tougher for many, many people in all brackets of, those demographics from the poor to the middle classes.
It's a good article, actually. I read it today.
It's getting much tougher. But Alcoholics Anonymous was born out of that time. There was a coming together, a mutual aid. The cooperative movement was born out of that time. There were great social and political upheavals that came out of a result of, a time that was really harmful. So, it's that yin and the yang, isn't it? It's the spiritual paradox of don't be too frightened. Do not be afraid. Like God wins in the end, of course I'm going to say that, and it's not about having a positive mental attitude, it's about ploughing forward, it's about being resilient, it's about persevering, it's about, being tenacious, it's about no surrender.
Perfect. Look, I think that's wonderful. That's a great, I was going to ask you one other question, but I'm not going to do that today. I think that's a great end to the conversation, and that what you've just articulated is an echo that I'm hearing here as well. In a meeting today, we saw that as well. But look, Annemarie Ward, your work is, again, we want to celebrate it today. We're going to put Annemarie's contacts and details and the work she does with Subtract and her blogs and all bits and pieces and the work from Faces and Voices of Recovery UK in the podcast episode brief, which will be coming out hopefully next Wednesday. So keep an eye out for that. You'll get this when you get this, but that'll be part of that as well. So Annemarie Ward, thank you again for joining us today on the Unnecessary Harm podcast. Absolute gems in what you're saying. Value your work, value your time. Until next time, subscribe, check in, chime in, share it around, and see what we can do to shift the narrative of our culture back to the things we've talked about today. Until then, stay away from unnecessary harm.
As we wrap up today's session, remember, each step towards understanding is a step away from unnecessary harm. We're here to empower, inspire, and pave the way for optimal well-being. Stay resilient, stay informed, and continue being the change your community needs. Thank you for joining us at the Unnecessary Harm podcast. Until next time, take care and keep pushing forward.